To start, we will talk about the success or failure of the Endangered Species Act of 1973. Is the Endangered Species Act effective? This is a question that is not very easily answered and has many aspects to it that one must look at. How are we gauging the effectiveness of the ESA? Has the ESA helped make the environment better than the environment from the past? Currently, people have different standards in this present time for what is expected for the protection of the environment. Our society today expects more for the future protection of the environment. To say that any law or regulation has been effective, you must look at what the past was, what is happening at the present, and what is the environment going to be like in the future. You cannot look at these from a single period and answer, but you must rather look at them collectively. The Endangered Species Act of 1973 was passed by Congress. The ESA created a way for the federal government to define endangered and threatened, make plants and all invertebrates eligible for protection, apply broad take prohibitions to all endangered animal species, and allowed the prohibitions to apply to threatened animal species by special regulation, require federal agencies to use these authorities to conserve listed species and consult on may affect actions, to prohibit federal agencies from authorizing, funding, or carrying out any action that would jeopardize a listed species or destroy or modify its critical habitat, made matching funds available to the states with cooperative agreements, provide funding authority for land acquisitions for foreign species, and implemented sites protection in the United States. Between 1978 and 2004, Congress enacted amendments to the ESA but left the framework of the ESA unchanged. In 1978, the amendments provisions were added to Section 7, allowing federal agencies to undertake an action that would jeopardize listed species if the action is exempted by a cabinet-level committee convened for this purpose. Critical habitat was required to be designated concurrently with listing a species when prudent, and economic and other impacts of designations were required to be considered in deciding on boundaries. The Secretary of Agriculture for the Forest Service was directed to join the Secretaries of Interior, Commerce, and the Defense in developing a program for conserving fish and wildlife plants, including listed species. Land acquisition authority was extended to all species. The definition of species with respect to populations was restricted to vertebrates. Otherwise, any species, subspecies, or variety of plant, or species or subspecies of animal remained eligible for the protection under the Act. The 1982 amendments, determinations of the status of species were required to be made solely on the basis of biological and trade information, without consideration of possible economic or other effects. A final rule to determine the status of a species was required to follow within 1 year of its proposal unless withdrawn for cause. This requirement replaced a 2-year limit that had been enacted in 1978 on adopting a final rule. Failure to meet the 2-year deadline had been grounds for mandatory withdrawals of more than 1,500 proposed species listings in 1979. Section 10 included a provision to designate experimental populations of listed species that could be subject to different treatments under Section 4 for critical habitat, Section 7 for interagency cooperation, and Section 9 for prohibitions. Section 9 included a prohibition against removing endangered plants from land under federal jurisdiction and reducing them to possession. Section 10 introduced habitat conservation plans providing incidental take permits for listed species in connection with otherwise lawful activities. 1988 amendments. Monitoring candidate and recovered species was required with adoption of emergency listing when there is evidence of significant risk. Several amendments dealt with recovery matters. Recovery plans were required to undergo public notice and comment, and affected federal agencies were required to give consideration to those comments. New subsection 4G required 5 years of monitoring recovered species, and reports were required on the development and implementation of recovery plans and on the status of all species with plans. A new Section 18 required a report of all reasonable identifiable expenditures by the federal government and states that receive Section 6 funds on a species-by-species basis on the recovery of endangered or threatened species, and protection for endangered plants was extended to include a prohibition on malicious destruction on federal land and other take that violates state law. (2004) Amendments. National Defense Authorization Act, Public Law Number 108 through 136, Congress enacted an associated amendment to the Endangered Species Act. Section 4 exempted the Department of Defense from critical habitat designation so long as an integrated natural resource management plan prepared under Section 101 of the Sykes Act and acceptable to the Secretary of Interior is in place. Is the ESA a success? The ESA is a success in my opinion. The ESA has protected many species that have been listed as either endangered or threatened. In fact, according to Karen Suckling, 2011, for the Center of Biological Diversity, the ESA is effective because 99.9% of species protected by the Act have been kept from extinction. And where measured, 93% of protected species are moving toward recovery. In my opinion, without the ESA, many of the species placed on the list would have surely gone extinct by now. To call this ESA a failure is not giving the ESA its due respect in regard to what it has been able to accomplish. Through the power of the ESA, we can now protect a species from extinction, so that it may have the chance to recover at 2 healthy levels. I tend to look at what could have possibly been lost forever if the ESA was not enacted. Has it failed? There are many critics of the ESA for many different reasons. These reasons do have some validity, but not all do. The critics of the Endangered Species Act think that the ESA has failed in few areas. One of those areas seems to be the lack of recovery of the species placed on the ESA. The argument that the ESA does not rehabilitate animal species back to healthy, sustainable levels is people looking at the ESA as a glass half empty. While this may be true in some regards, it is not entirely the case. Many animal species placed on the list have not even reached the required date of recovery. There is currently 1,396 species protected on average. They have been on the list for 21 years. Federal recovery plans state that it would take 42 years from listing to recovered status. Another problem, they also believe that too much money is being spent on the protection of the animal species on the ESA, with little to no benefits being shown. Basically, the ESA is not worth the money being spent. I, for one, do not mind paying taxes as long as I know that part of that money is being used to help protect animal species. Also, the ESA does not have economical consideration in place when listing flora or fauna. So if a big oil company wants to drill in an area that is known to have an endangered species, they are stopped from doing so. Looking at a few oil company websites, they state that if they were allowed to drill, the economy of that region would significantly improve. Which may be true, but what it appears to look like is that making money by drilling in this area is worth it, no matter the cost of what would be lost potentially. Next comes property rights. Property rights are maybe the single most complained about area within the ESA from what I have seen. The Fifth Amendment prohibits our government from taking private property without just compensation, or if it is to be for public use. The ESA allows for the government to take under these terms for the protection of flora and fauna. This does not sit well with your average Joe who works hard for what they have. Larger companies do not like this either because it can stop a money-making project dead in its tracks. According to Rothstein III, The Endangered Species Act is often implemented as a prohibitive policy, telling people what they cannot do. And such law is unlikely to succeed unless we adequately interpret what is being affirmed with the prohibitions. The Act seeks to protect certain values that it finds are carried by endangered species. And since these are not the usual utilities associated with natural resources, protecting them may seem implausible when that protection prejudices property rights. In an apparent upshot, plants seem to trump people, but the real upshot is that a positive respect for life prohibits certain uses of property. This is a subject that lies deep within all citizens. The rights of the citizen or the rights of the natural world, who will win out? I value all of the rights given to me as an American citizen, but at what point do I jeopardize losing the natural wonders to save what I have or myself? My views on the act. The contrast to how many people feel about the ESA is what needs to be changed. I do believe that greed, partially on both sides, may have a role in some of these feelings. As for the general public, I believe that the ESA needs to be amended so that it involves the general public. More information needs to be put out into the public so that it becomes common knowledge. When the public does not understand or feel uninvolved, they tend to care less. As a whole, I believe that a large majority would want to protect the environment as a whole. More and more of the populace is becoming eco-friendly, and the environment is far more important to the public than ever before. For anything to work in our system, the public has to be involved in part of the decision process. I think too many people sit around and allow the government to make whatever decision they like, and not knowing what the benefits or negatives are. Get involved and change what needs to be changed. With regard to the property rights, I certainly do not agree or disagree with someone who says they are not willing to give up their home because the government wants them to, or because there's an endangered species. I certainly would not want to give up what I have worked for my family. This is an issue that I do not believe can easily be solved. Property rights are not the same as other rights. Again, as stated by Rothstein III, in ethical and legal thought, there are inalienable strong rights such as the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Infringing these rights assaults a person's dignity or security. But property rights belong to the class of weak rights, and hence can be amended to serve the common good. Property rights have certain strength in the sense that they are well developed legally, being much fought over. But they are nevertheless weak. In a sense, evidence is just this long legislative tradition. Every state regulates the ways in which property owners may develop their land, and the more special and ecological sensitivity, the land. A floodplain, a coastal zone, a wetland, open space, a scenic or historical significant place, the tighter the regulations. Such regulations do not violate a person's dignity or security or even a person's liberty in any deep sense, as do violating free speech, establishing religion, disenfranchising, denying a jury trial, or imposing unjust imprisonment. As citizens of this nation, we must decide how we want our future to look. The question of how far are we willing to let the environment be corrupted and how much are we willing to give up to save the environment is a valid question that must be asked. We as humans have the power to change the world. It just depends on if we use this power for good or for bad.